Okay, please be seated. So, members of the jury, we've reached the point for closing arguments. I expect the state goes first, the defense responds, the state may go again, and then the defense may go again. That's how it's set up under the rules at this point. So just sit back, relax. Ms. George, are you all set?
I am, Your Honor.
Okay.
Thank you. I don't know if Keith has been lights off out there.
Do you want the lights off right now?
Just want to make sure you can see it. Ooh. All right. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I know it's been a long couple of weeks, and you guys have heard a lot of evidence in this case. There are, like the judge said, there's two opportunities for the state to come up and talk to you about the way that the state believes the evidence came in and what that describes. The first opportunity that I have, I'm going to just talk to you about the charges against the defendant. And then I'll come up again afterwards and talk to you about the specifics as to the insanity defense. So first, the state has to have proven the charges that we brought against Mr. Bourgoin beyond a reasonable doubt. So the first charges that we brought against Mr. Bourgoin was 5 counts of second-degree murder. The first element that the state has to have proven was that it was in fact Mr. Bourgoin that committed the offense. And although that's not technically contested in this case, it's still incredibly important that the state proves it beyond a reasonable doubt. So I'm going to go through with you the evidence that the state believes proved that. First, you heard from Chris Page. He is the neighbor of Mr. Bourgoin. He identified Mr. Bourgoin in this courtroom. He stated that he saw Mr. Bourgoin get into his truck shortly before the crashes and leave his property at a very high rate of speed, and I believe stated that he thought he might flip his truck. He was going so fast. You also heard from Keith Porter. Keith Porter is the first individual on the scene who interacts with Mr. Bourgoin. He states that when he came upon him after he'd come up from the median, he looked upset, and he stated,
he just says, I don't know what happened, I just lost control.
That he just lost control. You further heard evidence regarding Mr. Bourgoin's Toyota Tacoma. Specifically that Mr. Bourgoin was the only person who ever drove it, even though it was registered to Anila's father, Joel Nijman. You also heard that his DNA was found on the steering wheel airbag within the car, with a chance of that happening of 1 in 1 quadrillion. And you heard that his injuries were consistent with someone who was wearing a driver's side seatbelt. The second element that the state has to have proven is that Mr. Bourgoin caused the death of each person named in each count. So this means whether or not the state has to have proven it wasn't natural causes, it wasn't some other event, but for Mr. Bourgoin's conduct, these deaths would not have occurred. Count 1 is Mary Harris. Mary Harris was 16 years old at the time of her death. The medical examiner testified that the cause of her death was blunt force trauma of the torso and head. And the manner of death was homicide. She was an ejected passenger, the rear seat, in a car that collided with Mr. Bourgoin's truck. Count 2 is Cyrus Shao. Cyrus Shao was 16 years old at the time of his death. The medical examiner told you that the cause of his death was blunt force trauma to his torso and head. Medical examiner told you that the manner of his death was homicide, as he was the driver of the car that collided with Mr. Bourgoin's truck. Count 3 is Liam Hale. Mr. Hale was 16 years old at the time of his death. Medical examiner again told you that he died from blunt force trauma of his head and ruled the manner of death, a homicide, as he was also a rear seat passenger of a car in the collision with Mr. Bourgoin's truck. Count 4 is Janie Cozy. Ms. Cozy was 15 years old at the time of her death. The medical examiner told you that she died from blunt force trauma of her torso and head, and also ruled the manner of her death a homicide. She was the front seat passenger of the car that collided with Mr. Bourgoin's truck. Count 5, Eli Brookins. Mr. Brookins was 16 years old at the time of his death. The medical examiner ruled the cause of his death, blunt force trauma of his head. Manner of death, homicide. He was the right rear seat passenger in a vehicle that collided with Mr. Bourgoin's truck. Nothing about any of these deaths was natural, but for Mr. Bourgoin's conduct on the night of October 8th, 2016, none of these deaths would have occurred. The third element that the state needs to prove is that the conduct or the killing was unlawful. And this is really saved for cases of potential self-defense or some sort of defense that the killing was necessary, either a defense of someone else or some other necessity. There's no evidence that anything to that extent has happened or did happen in this case. And finally, the state has to have proven that Mr. Bourgoin acted with a wanton disregard of the likelihood that death or great bodily harm would result. And I see some of you taking notes. You will have all of these instructions as well written down, so you don't have to memorize it. But a wanton act is a reckless act that's done with extreme indifference to the probability that someone would or could die or have great bodily harm from the conduct. It's more than just an extreme negligence, and the state must prove that Mr. Bourgoin was actually aware of the risk and that he ignored the risk. So in determining Mr. Bourgoin's state of mind at the time of the crashes and the time of the charges after that, you must consider all of the facts and all of the circumstances as they were presented in this case. What facts or circumstances were established by the evidence that prove that Mr. Bourgoin was aware of the risk and ignored it? You heard from David Kelleher, who called 911 that night. He was very clear that Mr. Bourgoin got on the interstate at exit 11 going the right way. This is not a case of an individual who got on the interstate accidentally the wrong way. Mr. Bourgoin got on the interstate heading the right direction. He merged appropriately onto the interstate. After about 100 yards of driving is when he decided to stop, do a K-turn, and then go north in the southbound lane. You heard from Mark Walker, who was passed by Mr. Bourgoin. He said that he was focused and determined, that he stayed in the passing lane, that he was flying. In his 911 call, he said, "I was just trying to get the hell out of the way." He was flying. He was steady in his speed. Rachel Stillwell told you that she honked on her horn at Mr. Bourgoin when he passed her on the interstate, that she flashed her lights at him, that Mr. Bourgoin stayed in the passing lane. Todd Smith, again, Mr. Bourgoin stayed in the passing lane. Colleen Flynn said she laid on her horn as Mr. Bourgoin passed her. She said, gosh, I hope he doesn't hurt someone. Gosh, he was going so fast. Mr. Bourgoin, again, stayed in the passing lane. And Aaron Farr. The evidence shows that Ms. Farr was the last person that Mr. Bourgoin passed. The defense expert made an opinion on the stand that Ms. Farr must have got her placement on the map wrong, that she didn't believe that Ms. Farr was as close to this crash as she was. But Ms. Johnson, the defense expert, did not call 911 that night. Ms. Johnson was never at the scene. Ms. Johnson doesn't know that road, that passage of roadway like Ms. Farr does. And when Ms. Farr was sitting in that seat and testified to her placement on the map, and the defense had an opportunity to ask her more questions about that, they did not. So the evidence is that Ms. Farr was the last person to pass Mr. Bourgoin right before the crash, and that he was in the passing lane. Ms. Farr also testified that she had just passed the Jetta. She has a clear memory of passing the Jetta and seeing the kids inside the car. That she gets past Mr. Bourgoin, she calls 911. So we know where Mr. Bourgoin was. He was in the passing lane. But 4.8 seconds prior to impact, he's going straight to 0 degree. He's going 81.5 miles an hour. We know that. 4.3 seconds before impact, he's still going straight, 83.47 miles per hour. At 3.8 seconds prior to impact, he's going 85.33 miles, still going straight. At 3.3 seconds prior to impact, he starts to turn to the left. He's going 86.67 miles an hour, faster and faster. At 2.8 seconds prior to impact, he's turning left even more towards the travel lane, going 88.53 miles per hour. And at 2.3 seconds prior to impact, he's going even further to the left, towards the travel lane, towards the breakdown lane, at 89.87 miles an hour. 1.8 seconds prior to impact, he's back turning right, at 89.87 miles per hour. 1.3 seconds prior to the crash, he takes a sharp right, going 86.67 miles per hour. And at 0.8 seconds prior to impact, he's going even farther right, going 83 miles an hour. 0.3 seconds, sharp right, going 78 miles an hour. And at impact, he's still turning right, going 78.3 miles per hour, where he hits the Volkswagen Jetta nearly head on. This is a wanton disregard. The evidence is clear that Mr. Bourgoin knew what he was doing. He knew he was in the passing lane. He knew he was going the wrong way. There was people telling him he was going the wrong way, but he also knew he was going the wrong way because he got on the interstate the right way, and he made the choice to go the wrong way. People are honking at him, people are flashing their lights at him, and he continues at a steady rate, a fast rate, in the passing lane until he gets to the Jetta. That point, before that, the 5 seconds before that, he's pulling into the left, and then he's sharp right, striking the Jetta at 78 miles an hour, while the Jetta at that point is going 33 miles an hour. The next charges that the state brought against Mr. Bourgoin are aggravated operation of a vehicle without that owner's consent and grossly negligent operation of a motor vehicle. And from the state's perspective, the really early moments of the cruiser video of Officer Shepard's cruiser are crucial in determining Mr. Bourgoin's state of mind on this night. Pay close attention to the body language of Mr. Bourgoin in this video, the decisions, the conscious decisions he makes in this video and when he makes them, compared to what he told the experts he was feeling at that time about a vehicle just being there, just happened to be there. Take a closer look at the body language that Mr. Bourgoin presents in this video. And in the moments where he gets up to the road and he has a conversation with Keith Porter,
He just says, I don't know what happened, I just lost control.
that's what he says. Don't know what happened, I just lost control. Is this a man who looked up from the median, having just seen mannequins in a vehicle, and then sees a car that just happens to be waiting there for him? So he takes it, thinking it's there for him. Or is this a man who has just seen a law enforcement officer arrive, waits for that law enforcement officer to pass him, and in fact turns his back to the law enforcement officer as he's running towards him, and then, and only when, Officer Shepard runs down to the median to try to save the people in the car, does Mr. Bourgoin run towards the cruiser. When Officer Nadeau is seen in the U-turn that Mr. Bourgoin stops. He's listening to the radio traffic this entire time. He knows one officer's coming behind him, and he knows there's another officer ahead of him in the U-turn. And when he could have stopped at that moment, he doesn't. Instead, turns around, he goes back towards the scene, and he goes back towards the scene faster and faster and faster, passing Sergeant Claffey, at 95 miles an hour, continues to elevate his speed, and crashes back into his own vehicle going 107 miles an hour. Mr. Bourgoin was well aware when he was coming back into the scene that there was people all over that scene because he had just left it. He knew there was cars there. He knew there was people there. The witnesses on the scene described hearing Mr. Bourgoin coming back into the scene with the police cruiser. Wide open throttle. My head was spinning at the time, along with everyone else's. Sue Janes described the scene as Armageddon, a war zone, carnage, stuff everywhere. Owen Ballinger, trooper, testified that the cruiser went from 97 miles per hour, sped up to 107 miles per hour at impact with no braking. Everyone was screaming, "I thought I was dead. Oh my God, this looks like a war zone." He wasn't slowing down. He was going straight back into the scene. Keith Porter again described the scene as a war zone, incredibly disturbing. I was in shock. I was trying to piece together what had happened, and it wasn't making much sense. Mary Ryan Lambert said everyone was screaming, crying. It was absolute chaos. She thought there was gunshots because the ammo from the police cruiser was on fire and exploding. The state has proven in each of these charges that Mr. Bourgoin was aware of every decision he made, and he ignored the risks of each of those decisions. There's been a lot of talk about motive, and I'll go into it a little bit again later, but the motive of somebody's conduct is not an element. It's not an element that the state needs to prove. And I know we want motive a lot of time, but it is important that you listen to the jury instructions about what the state is required to prove. And from the state's perspective, that's, at least as far as it's contested in this case, is his mental state at the time and whether he knew what he was doing. Whether he knew what he was doing and he could have conformed his conduct, but he chose not to. The state believes that if you look at all of the evidence that's been presented to you in this trial, you will find, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Mr. Bourgoin committed 5 counts of second-degree murder, that he is guilty of every one of those counts, but that also he's guilty of aggravated operation without owner's consent, and grossly negligent operation. These facts support that. This evidence that you heard from this witness box supports that beyond any reasonable doubt. And the judge will also instruct you what reasonable doubt means. That doesn't mean all doubt. It means a real doubt. there has to be a real doubt, which comes from a fair and a rational consideration of all of the evidence. The state believes that every element in this case has been proven beyond that reasonable doubt. Thank you.